Alright, hello everyone. Oh, I gotta pull up the chat. There we go. Can everyone hear me? Type something in the chat. Hello. Alright, hello everyone. There we go. Alright, well, so today our talk's all over history of hacking, and gonna be going over basically what hacking came from, how it existed before computers, and a lot of the really common stuff that's been spreading recently, just big malware that you probably heard in the news occasionally. But before we get into that, everyone please take a moment to sign in. I should actually sign in. If you don't sign in, you don't get any virtual pizza. Alright, so the QR code link's still there, but we have a few announcements to go through. First of all, we're looking for volunteers to help with CTFs, so if you're interested and you're willing to learn, or if you've done CTF challenges before, message @crash in Discord. We have a little committee now. You won't be working alone, but it'll be best if you have a little bit of experience. And then next week we have our first corporate talk for the semester, which will be Paycom. It'll be the same normal time, Wednesday at 7. So tune in next week, because that'll be a good one. And then just after, as usual, we're going to have, after the talk, we're going to join the CSG general chat and Discord so that we can go over questions and just talk about whatever your favorite piece of malware is or something. But yeah, if everyone's good on that, we'll get into it. So Doggo, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So we'll first take a look at older hacking, i.e. like the 1900s, and as the internet bloomed and became a bigger thing. The first thing that really popped out as the internet was taking shape was through telecommunications lines, which were the foundations for the internet. And that was where some of the first hacking or the first traces of modern day hacking showed up. This showed up in the form of phreaking, which emerged in the early 1950s as telephone networks and companies like AT&T continued to grow, and telephones became more popular in houses. So they were based around hacking telephone networks to be able to take over some of the phone lines and gain free access to long distance calls, or free access to calls in general. So they reverse engineered the tone systems that AT&T and other phone companies had set up on their telephone lines or operation lines to signal that this was going to be a long-range call or a short-range call, or we're going to charge this much for a call, or things like that. And after they reverse engineered those systems, they were able to replicate the tonal frequencies using computers, or sometimes even just their voices, and eventually automated these frequencies using blue boxes, which became extremely popular to gain access to free phone calls through companies like AT&T. Eventually, AT&T and other companies encrypted these lines and used separate phone lines to transfer the signals, and that led to the disappearance of phreaking by the 1980s. Next, we can talk about the first major breaches or security incidents as the internet was growing. Eventually, before the internet was as big as it was today, it was just a network of universities, government labs, and government institutions that would be able to talk to each other over their version of the internet called ARPANET. And this was the first version of the internet where a lot of big breaches or other security incidents took place before anybody could gain free access to it. So one of the first big breaches was made by a group called the 414s, and they broke into banks, nuclear laboratories, and research centers. And these people were just a group of teenagers who were literally just messing around with computers that they had access to at school. And just by messing around and doing what they just wanted to do on computers and learning more, they were able to breach big banks in the US and nuclear laboratories that controlled things like launch codes and did research into nuclear weapons. And all of these people were arrested and obviously prosecuted by the government, but this was one of the first major incidents that brought a lot of light towards what hackers or people with malicious intent could do with computer systems. Another very big breach was the Morris worm. This was the first major worm to infect the internet and one of the first viruses to infect computer systems and other architecture. This infected 6,000 computers on ARPANET, which was the precursor to the internet, and this was a very crippling attack, especially for the internet in its early stages, because nobody really understood the extent of the attack, or nobody knew how to take care of the attack or get rid of the worm from computer systems without a long, tedious 2-day process. So this was the start of a lot of malware detection and antivirus systems that were based in humans, right, where they would partition networks off and regularly check their systems to make sure that there were no viruses or worms or other things that could be damaging to their systems. We can move on to the 1990s. So as the World Wide Web launches and hacking grows in popularity, a lot of people all over the world began to partake in major hacking incidents or just messing around in general against big ISPs, banks, and governments. At this point, only big tech companies really only had secured internet infrastructure, and a lot of government entities, banks, ISPs, etc., did not have the tools or the necessary knowledge to secure their services or their data very well. So this was where we first see the basic attacks that a lot of computer security technicians talk about, like DDoS attacks or scripts. A lot of general scripts were first posted and sent out around the internet in the 1990s to take part in attacks and things like that, along with DDoS attacks, which were used against ISPs and bigger entities like Microsoft as the internet grew in popularity. And these DDoS attacks really showed the government and other people like Microsoft or Google or other tech companies how hacking with a lot of devices can really be used against a lot of companies or entities, and how a lot of infrastructure could be vulnerable to attacks. So one of the first DDoS attacks was against Microsoft's website in the 1990s, and that crashed their website, and that really showed Microsoft and other entities that they had insecure infrastructure, and a lot of their security really needed to be brought up to date, along with Windows, which grew a lot in popularity in the 90s, and a lot of vulnerabilities or attacks were found in Windows, which led to a lot of breaches in Windows software, and Microsoft obviously having to come back and patch those breaches. And a lot of this can still be seen today as people still discover Windows security problems and issues that Microsoft software might have.
Yeah, so moving into the 2000s, we kind of have the birth of what our modern viruses and stuff look like, and not too much has changed. We'll go over some of the major ones, but I'm just going to go by payloads. So basically, in malware, the payload is what you're trying to achieve with the software. So there's always an exploit and a payload, and the exploit, they change, they pop up, and there's different ones. That's always, as a security researcher, that's usually what you're looking for. But payloads are pretty consistent over time, so we're going to go by that, because that's the easiest way to categorize them. So first of all, we have like the most common, or at least the most recognizable as malware, is like adware. Usually they're exploiting pay-per-click advertisements. So if you're not familiar, basically most online advertising isn't actually, like, the person who's hosting the website doesn't talk to the advertiser. They rather have an account set up with someone like Google or some other major ad network, and every time someone clicks on an ad on their website, they get a little bit of money. So what hackers do is they take these, they sign up for an account, and then they make users click on ads by usually disguising them as something else. And a lot of times adware isn't the only thing that will get put on a computer. It's not insanely profitable, because most people will recognize it as a malware and try and get rid of it. But then we move on to spyware, which is pretty much the most common, like, I mean, the second most common after, it's more common than adware in distribution, but most people wouldn't recognize it as much, because usually it's running in the background. So that comes with things like keyloggers. Hold on. I'm looking at the questions. We'll get to that. Looking at things like keyloggers, file extractors, network traffic interceptors. So they're basically just trying to steal your data in some form, whether that's like important files you have downloaded or passwords to something like your Spotify account that they can sell to someone else through various sketchy websites. But yeah, that's basically what spyware is. And we go on to ransomware. Ransomware is really where, like, we've seen a lot of it since like around 2015. We have the first one, the first major piece of ransomware was CryptoLocker. And basically what ransomware does is it gets on your system and encrypts or somehow restricts you from using it, using your computer. So CryptoLocker was the first one to really become popular around 2007. It spread pretty widely, but it only encrypted what were deemed valuable files. So some things like what would be family photos or whatever. So it wasn't very deeply integrated into the computer, which meant that if you had backups, then you can usually just remove it. Of course, most people don't have backups because that's the world we live in, but you know, that's how ransomware makes their money, as they demand a ransom. So something more recent was Petya. Petya was the first attack to move on from like just encrypting specific files into moving and encrypting the entire hard drive. The way it did this was it used the NTFS master file table. So NTFS is used on all Windows computers. It's kind of a crutch, in my opinion, of just the Windows operating system. But basically all of the important file data is stored at one place in the hard drive, usually towards the beginning of the partition. And so this will include like file names, where the files are stored on the hard drive. Basically everything you need to get data off the hard drive. So if you just take this, if you encrypt that, then you basically have encrypted the entire hard drive. So Petya did a lot of damage, but nothing near what this next one did, which would be WannaCry. WannaCry has showed up in the news for all kinds of things because it just never seems to go away. The biggest target for WannaCry was the British National Health System. So the British government's like health records were encrypted, and it was estimated to do somewhere between $4 and $8 billion of damage. But because of a lot of the fallout of this, you'll see some of the newer ransomware stuff, especially with coronavirus, they actually pledge not to attack hospitals because, you know, people can die when you don't have access to your systems in hospitals. So it's an interesting thing, someone to demand ransom and then, you know, have some kind of moral. But yeah, similar to WannaCry was Bad Rabbit. Bad Rabbit was, the main difference was that it was, the way it got into most computers was with drive-by attacks. So it used browser exploits on like compromised websites. So you would go to a website and then it would install in the background without you noticing. Usually by having some kind of flash pop up, you know, say enable flash on this page, and that's not actually enabling flash because flash is garbage. So yeah, but all the Petya, WannaCry, and Bad Rabbit, the reason that all these were able to grow so widely was because they took advantage of the Eternal Blue Windows exploit, which was basically a NT kernel exploit. So basically everything since Windows 2000, every version of Windows since Windows 2000 used the Windows NT kernel, which meant that there were a lot of computers vulnerable, and I should say this exploit has existed since then, but it wasn't super public until a bunch of NSA data was leaked, and it was something that the NSA had been using. But after it was leaked by leaked from the NSA, someone took it and ported it over, and you'll see the word Eternal Romance, which basically means that after, I don't know, 2008, there was some update that broke the original Eternal Blue exploit, but they fixed it, or ported it over, and pretty much every Windows computer that was in existence was vulnerable until it was patched out pretty recently. I'll go over a few questions. Did TMOC make the Silk Road? I don't know, but it's very possible if you know the history. Why you gotta single out my grandma like this? Look, she's a sweet lady, I'm sure, but it's just the truth, man. Can you friend me on Steam? Sure, hit me up in the Discord after the meeting and I'll add you. Did I have pop-ups that I didn't notice? I probably. Alright, so we'll move on to bots. So bots are really ransomware can make you a lot of money fast, but bots is more important than money, of course, to hackers, is power. So bots will give you a crap ton of computing power. The idea is you just have something running in the background and you take over someone's computer. Not that you like prevent them from using it, but when you want to use it, you kick them off and use it for whatever you want. So there's a good chance that you own a device that has a bot on it in some capacity, because we'll get into it a bit later, but most IoT devices are the biggest contributors to botnets right now. So botnets are mainly used for sending out spam. That's what they've classically been used for, as well as DDoS attacks. And when I say spam, I mean it could come in the form of spam emails or using your IP to like try and brute force an SSH login or something. But also there's DDoS attacks, which is basically you tell every computer to start sending network traffic to this one IP address, and it will overload it if you have a big enough botnet. And DDoS attacks are something that you can really only do if you have such a widely distributed network. Like, even if you had a bunch of your own computing horsepower, most firewalls and stuff will be able to block out a region if it's giving them enough trouble. But botnets are able to circumvent that by looking kind of like genuine traffic. And more recently, we've seen botnets used to mine crypto. So, you just use their computing horsepower, they're paying for the electricity, and then it just sends all the money to you. So the big thing with botnets is you need some way to control them. Take a drink of water. Yeah, so botnets, you need a way to control them. And that's really hard, because how do you keep yourself anonymous? How do you make sure that someone else doesn't take over your botnet? Well, there's a few different ways that we've seen botnets controlled. We have telnet's the most simple. It's kind of your classical, you have one server that is telling all the other computers what to do. The problem with this is that if someone gets a hold of your botnet code running on the client, then they can track down your server and try and get it taken down, whether that's through contacting the company that's hosting it or even the local government or something like that. But on a lot of small scale botnets, that's how you'll see them run, just because it's very easy to do. You also have IRC, which is a little bit more disconnected, but has the same kind of issues as Telnet. The main reason that IRC is used is because it's extremely low bandwidth. You're basically just sending text. So that means that you can have basically 1 or 2 packets sent, and that tells your servers or your compromised computers what to do. After that, we have P2P, which is peer-to-peer. That's a lot of the bigger botnets you'll see use peer-to-peer. The reason is it's decentralized. If you've ever used torrents, you know how that works. Now, the way that they actually authenticate, the way that you prove that you're the correct, you're the person that should be in control, is with public key cryptography. So all the zombie servers, which are like the compromised computers, will have a public key, and then you'll use your private key to encrypt the command, distribute it out, and then they'll run it through, verify that it's correct, and then run your command. And then you have web/DNS. So that's just in your typical form of like, here's a website, and you have that. It's a lot more common in now that we live in an API world. A lot of people are familiar with that kind of system. But usually when they're running from some domain name, they're using what's called a bulletproof host, which is something like if you ever been on a sketchy website, .ru, .is, these like usually foreign domain top level domain names. The reason they use those is because they're protected by the provider. The provider doesn't care what they're used for. Now, a lot of times the provider won't care, but eventually if you get big enough, then the government will step in. And then, of course, my favorite is the Britney Spears approach, which is where there was some major botnet which used Britney Spears' Instagram, and what they did is they made a comment on a picture that had like 7,000 comments, and it was just the botnet checked that and used that to it was basically a hash, which they used to, which it turned into a command and ran. So you'll see this across all kinds of social media. A lot of times it'll be Instagram or Twitter or something that has just a lot of text a lot of text throughput. But the reason that you do this is because it's really easy to disguise, because seeing 10,000 computers access an IP address in Russia is kind of suspicious, but you see 10,000 computers accessing Instagram, well, that's pretty normal. So it's really hard to detect. Yes. Alright, so more about bots. I like bots. So some of the biggest examples of botnets, we have Storm, which it was based off, the reason it's called Storm is because it was originally spread with a email that was like there were 300 people dead from storm in Europe or something. It was a phishing email that got the initial installs and spread out, and then it used some Windows exploit. I don't remember which one, but it used some Windows exploit to spread as a worm, and then eventually it got big enough that it turned active. And the reason that Storm was able to stay alive for so long was it was extremely decentralized, and they had a lot of work put into their code to make it a moving target, basically. So it would change host servers all the time. It would reroute traffic similar to like what Tor does, with all kinds of crazy hard to track stuff. And then we have Cut Whale, which I believe had the most, at least at the time, it had the most infected hosts. This was, I think, around 2008-9. I might not be right, but there were 1.5 to 2 million infected computers, and a lot of them were. This was before the IoT days, so a lot of them were full-fledged computers. They had a lot of power behind them. It sent out 75 billion messages per day, billion emails per day, which accounted for around 45% of all the spam like in the world at the time. I don't know if it's actually been taken down. I should check, but the interesting thing about it is it was just so massive that the creators didn't really know what to do with it, so they just opened it up for rent. So just like AWS, you can spin up an instance to run your Minecraft server. Well, Cut Whale, you could get a little section of to send out your spam emails. Then we have Mariposa. Mariposa's was just really big, and it was mainly used for DDoS, some spam stuff, but not as interesting. Methbot is another big botnet. It was really complicated traffic analysis, basically. It had like 6,000 different domains. So tracking down the original host was really hard. It was mainly used for ad fraud, which is where you just, again, use the pay-per-click type thing. But it was all controlled by one centralized server, unlike a lot of adware. So if someone caught on and blocked those ad channels, then they could update it and add more new ones. And then my favorite botnet, that's a weird thing to say probably, but is the Mirai botnet. So the Mirai botnet was based on IoT devices. It stood in the background for a long time, I think a year or two basically, where they were just adding more and more exploits. So they would write, the creator would write exploits for, all kinds of IoT devices, webcams, baby monitors, your smart doorbell, all kinds of crazy stuff. But there was just individual exploits written for all of these. So a lot of work was put into it, and then around I think early 2016, it became active and started seeing things. But the biggest thing that happened, you can see the timeline here. Oh yeah, I should have just fact checked this. Yeah, so 2016 it surfaced, and then they on October 21st they took down Dyn DNS. So if you remember back to October of 2016, the day that the internet stopped working, that was because of this botnet. So that's how significant of an impact these things can have, just at the scale that they're at. And that was kind of an awakening. And then not too long after, they took down Liberia, like the country of Liberia. They had like one main provider, internet provider, and it was, yeah, I can, I'll zoom in a bit. Oh fuck, that's not professional. I didn't say that. Maybe I'll post it in the Discord after if you're curious. I'll actually post a few different links in the Discord because there's some really good articles by like Cloudflare and Kaspersky and stuff that about some of these. So yeah, check Discord after. Yeah. And then, of course, the sci-fi, weird, futuristic, kind of real use of malware is for cyber warfare. And probably the most famous virus ever is Stuxnet. But it's most interesting because it was extremely targeted. It was made for uranium enrichment plants, specifically the centrifuges in Israeli uranium, or in I forgot, but it was made specifically for uranium enrichment centrifuges. And what it did is it didn't brick them. It just made them so that they wore out a little quicker than they should have. Like I think like 5 times quicker than they should have. Don't fact check me on that. It's probably wrong, but it was very secretive, and it was planted by. It's never been officially confirmed, but probably the American and Israeli governments, probably NSA worked on them. It's pretty. I think most people would agree that that's where it came from. Yeah. So the way that it actually got into the plants, they were air gapped completely. So that means that they have no connection to the internet. They weren't, there wasn't any way for data to get in or out because it's super secret military stuff. So what they did is they had some people on the inside, and they just did USB drive drops. So people picked up a USB drive outside, plugged it in, and there you go, biggest virus ever. But it was so good at proliferating itself that even now, however many years later, a decade later, we still see it show up in other on just random networks and stuff. But it doesn't do anything because it was made for uranium centrifuges. So unless you have a uranium centrifuge, no big problem. And then the other more recent example of malware being used for cyber warfare is NotPetya, which was launched against the Ukraine, specifically their banks, their bank system, and it took out a good portion of it. It was based on WannaCry, I believe, or no, it was based on Petya. They're all kind of the same thing, but. So it was a crypto locker, but it wasn't ransomware. They had, if you can see, it's kind of small, but they had a thing that said you could unlock it, but it never worked. Like if you sent Bitcoin to that address, they wouldn't unlock it. So it was just designed to be destructive, basically. And it became so big of a problem because it kept spreading after it took down the Ukrainian bank, and it hit a lot of shipping networks. So the there was one of the companies that got taken out was responsible for like 40% of the world's shipping. So it cost them $10 billion to fix, just for this one virus. All right, so now we're gonna move back to Dago for data breaches.
All right, so we'll continue with data breaches, or how some of these things that Wade discussed were used in more recent incidents or more like practical ways. I guess we can talk about a few recent incidents that a lot of people might know about or might be knowledgeable about. The first thing we'll talk about is social engineering, or the Twitter Bitcoin scam, as many people might recently know it as. So, social engineering is a tactic that a lot of hackers use when they want to break into a network but can't because they require credentials that they might not have. So, for example, if someone wants to break into like a data center or like into someone's office building, they obviously can't do that because they don't have like the necessary badge or the ID to get in. So social engineering is when they would, for example, trick a security guard or trick the employee themselves into giving the badge or access to the building or network or whatever you want to get into, even though you aren't supposed to actually have access. So it's a way of getting access to more confidential systems or systems that only a certain number of people have access to, by basically tricking the people who have access or who can grant access into giving you the access. So recently, in the past summer, on Twitter, a hacker was able to social engineer a Twitter employee who has access to a lot of verified Twitter accounts, like Obama's Twitter account or Elon Musk's, or other big names in like culture like that. And using social engineering, he was able to make the Twitter employee think that he needed access to his password or other credentials needed to log in. And he basically got the Twitter employee to tell him his password over the phone. And using his like username and password for Twitter's internal tools, he was able to log in and then just take over big Twitter accounts like Elon Musk's or Obama's, and basically just tweet out a scam that was like, hey, I'm going to send back 2 times as much Bitcoin as you send me at this address. And a lot of people fell for it. He made like $100,000 or something off of it before everything got patched by Twitter. But Twitter, interestingly enough, they handled this by blocking access to that Twitter employee's account. And then they continued to handle this event by blocking access from tweeting for all verified accounts, which were like the big accounts that were affected. And a lot of people thought that this showed like Twitter might be like a bit unprepared for attacks like these, where they might not be able to like quickly lock out some like types of accounts or things like that. But ultimately, the hacker here was caught because he used his like real name or real address when signing up for the Bitcoin wallet that he used to send all the money to, and the FBI like just went there and arrested him. It was like just a really simple mistake, and that's how a lot of hackers have been caught recently. But that's probably like a big recent incident with social engineering, and social engineering has become especially a lot more popular, especially as companies are switching to security that's based on credentials that only people would know, like passwords, usernames, or, for example, like 6-digit code that they text to your phone. And it's becoming a lot harder to steal people's like login information to bank accounts and things like that without actually having physical access. So social engineering has become a lot more popular recently, and it's used to a lot of the time to gain access to wider networks or systems. And another thing that we talk about is cloud-based attacks, which are also extremely popular. Hackers in modern times with technologies like platforms or technologies like AWS or Google Cloud have been able to sometimes steal people's credit card information or steal money and use Google Cloud resources or AWS resources to do to run things that they want to do, like for example DDoS a website or things like that. And that's like a very basic level of things that they could do with that. But something a lot of hackers have been doing nowadays is finding unsecured data in the cloud. So a popular service people use to store data is AWS Bucket, and a lot of AWS buckets have been found to be unsecure or don't really require much credential or authentication to log in. So hackers have been going through and looking around and trying to find unsecured data or data that doesn't really have any passwords or protection on it. And they've been taking the data, finding things like passwords, usernames, credit card information, and things like that, and either holding it for ransom or doing other bad things with it. An example of this would be in 2016 when Uber had 56 million user accounts, like usernames, passwords, addresses, and things like that, stolen from them just because they forgot to. There was an AWS bucket with a with I believe the username and password or an authentication for their GitHub account left on an AWS bucket that was unsecured, and they're able to log in just through that and then steal all that data and basically just sell it on the deep dark web for however much money they wanted. So a lot of these recent incidents have been something that a lot of people have found to be concerning, especially as hackers move from things like ransomware or adware into more sophisticated forms of attacks like botnets and bigger ransomware things like what infected the national health system in Britain. So a lot of this new wave of hacks or tools has been especially concerning, and there's a lot of things that people have been doing to secure this kind of stuff. Like for example, a lot of companies now require employees to carry a physical authentication token or USB drive that verifies that it's actually them logging into something. Or a lot of cloud providers nowadays require have a lot of messages asking you to secure your databases or buckets. And a lot of companies have also been auditing these sort of systems and getting hired by companies to make sure that their internal systems are secure. And that's been leading to a lot of awareness about things like security in these new ways that hackers are using.
Alright, so we're taking questions now. If you want to use the link, I have this. I don't know if there's really an answer to this, but maybe hop in general chat after, and he'll let you know his 10-day secret. If we have any more questions, I'll open up the stream chat and see. Alright, I guess not. So yeah, if we have more questions, we'll be in the CSG general chat. Whoever asked about the to zoom in on the graphics and stuff, I'll post. I have a bunch of, in my notes, I have a bunch of links to some of the articles I used when I was putting this presentation together. So yeah, I'll post a list of those, and we can talk there. But see you guys in a bit.